Welcome back. Please do take a little time to find your seats, settle yourself down in readiness for the second half. It's a game of two halves of our conference on ethics and utopias. My name is Tim Jackson. It's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome you. And the second half of the afternoon is first we'll have another panel session with my guests here. And then we are delighted that Rowan Williams, as the chair of our Nature of Prosperity Dialogue, is here to give a keynote after that. But first, let me just introduce to you the three speakers. And they are, as in the previous panel, in fact, in this case, all three of them, contributors to our essay series. And so, starting on my immediate right here, Roger Scruton teaches philosophy at the University of Buckinghamshire. He's the author of over 40 books, a writer, thinker, philosopher. And his essay is a broadly conservative vision of the idea of settling down and marking time, as he calls it in the title of the essay. Ruth Levitas is Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of Bristol, and as has already been mentioned, a former chair of the William Morris Society, so it's a particular pleasure to welcome here to talk about utopias and the role of utopias in our quest for sustainable prosperity. And John O'Neill is Professor of Political Economy at the University of Manchester. He's written widely on philosophy, political economy, and ecology. So it's a great pleasure to have them here, and I'd like you just to welcome all three of them with a round of applause. Thank you very much. So when I was thinking about how this session might go, and they are rather different essays, I settled on the idea that actually, in their different ways, each of the essays is talking about the idea of space and the space for change. And so that's the theme that we'll start off with in our discussion this afternoon, and we'll see where that goes. It can go, space can go in all sorts of different directions, obviously, and your questions and queries from the floor will be an important part of that. But we'll speak within the panel for the first 40 minutes or so, and I'd like to start with you, Roger. So there's a very provocative moment, actually, for me, provocative moment in your essay where you argue that any meaningful search for sustainable prosperity must begin with the love of home. Talk to us a little bit about that concept and how it provoked your essay.
Yes, I think this has been my theme for some time. I argue in my book, Green Philosophy, that really in confronting environmental questions, the most important thing is to find the motive in ordinary people that will lead them to take the initiatives to protect their environment rather than to exploit it for their immediate benefit. And I think we've had this already discussed to a certain extent this afternoon. What is it that actually motivates people to renounce the pursuit of their own immediate appetites for the sake of the long term, for the sake of assets which will otherwise not be replenished, and so on. And I point to the fact that, well, people do this regularly when they regard their environment as their own in some way, as the place to which they belong, their home. People earlier were saying, Ingrid in particular, was saying that that the real questions concern doing and being, and that's what we're appealing to in looking for an environmental philosophy. I would add that doing and being are important, but they only make sense for most people if they're part of belonging. So I want to say that belonging is really the idea that we need to emphasize and show how it is that people have used that idea in order to leave only a soft footprint on their immediate environment. I argue that this isn't done, on the whole, by any kind of top-down plan or an activist state taking charge of things. Because when you take charge of things, you, as it were, take them away from people, so that they lose the motive to take charge themselves. And I suppose, my first real experience of environmental angst was in the old days, in the 80s, traveling in communist Europe.
Roger, we have a little trouble with your mic, so we'll turn that one off, and if you could...
You want to turn me off? That's what it is.
No, not at all. Never.
Already.
Right.
Are we switched over? Yeah, good.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Seeing the results of the great top-down communist plan, which had all kinds of ecological things programmed into it, the results in Poland in particular were horrifying. The rivers with no life in them, sprawl everywhere, a decline of all biodiversity and all the rest. And I came to the conclusion very quickly that obviously we're not going to achieve a kind of equilibrium between human beings and their environment if the only mediator is the state. There must be some way in which people themselves can be encouraged to get together and do the thing. And I think it's appropriate to say in this place that we do have so many examples in this country of how it's done. The British Medical Association was started in 1834 by ordinary people, ordinary doctors, people like Dr. Lydgate in Middlemarch, and it survived right through till the creation of the National Health Service as a free association of volunteers, giving their time and their energy for nothing. And it created one of the great medical institutions of the modern world. And I feel that we should take those kind of things as our model.
Thank you very much. Let me just push that a little bit further with you, Roger, because there's some wonderful, almost poetic moments in your essay where you talk about this ability to settle down and mark time as offering us transcendent possibilities, immaterial feelings of contentment and well-being. That could be the basis of a sustainable prosperity. And I imagine that would resonate widely with a number of people. But you also began the essay with a quite difficult challenge, which you talked about a single cause of unsustainability, which is the tendency of people to take benefits and to externalize costs. So my challenge really is this love of home sufficient to overcome that single cause that you identify?
No, of course not. And when there's a long process on which one launches oneself when one asks the question, what can I do to remedy this? First of all, who will join me? That's the major thing, and I think everybody in this room, these are obviously joining people who would have that question at the front of their mind. Then, of course, what should our program be? But then there are the big questions: how will we get others to join voluntarily in with us? In my view, the worst thing to do is then, having got a program, to seek to impose it on people, regardless of their own desires. And that's why I say, let's look for the motives in ordinary people that get them that would prompt them to accept a program of change in a sustainable direction, without having to conscript them to it. And so I only mention the love of home because that's such an obvious example. But there are other examples too, and I feel if you look back over the environmental movement in our country, which didn't begin, in the 1960s, and it began at least in the late 17th century with the movement to preserve the forests and so on, and went all through the Romantic movement in art and literature, and of course in English modern music as well. Then I think you see that there really there are so many ways in which people want to give themselves to this sort of thing, and those ways should be invoked and respected.
Thank you, Roger. So that's our starting point, in a way, is this idea that within each of us there is a love of home, which could be the foundation for thinking differently about prosperity and about human well-being. Just to continue the footballing metaphor with which I kicked off the second half, the contrast between home in football is, of course, away. And it's an interesting kind of way to think about that tension of human motivation. And in a sense, Ruth, your essay is kind of about away, isn't it? It's about space in a different sense, the opening out of space for creativity, for the imaginary, for thinking even about the present from a different perspective. In your essay, you make a very strong claim that where there is no vision, the people perish. And this is the precise role that utopias have to play. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think the first thing to say is that while all the other speakers in these panels are some kind or other of philosophers, I'm actually a sociologist. And what sociology does is to conceptualize society as a system of interlinked and interdependent elements. And so it intrinsically demands that we think holistically about the interactions of motivations, institutions, economy, politics, and if we extend that to the ecosystem, since we are confronted with this problem of sustainability, we have to think systemically and holistically. Secondly, my starting point is that the system that we have is one which is not compatible with sustainability. We cannot go on like this. The other element of my work has been entirely about utopianism, and my argument is that what utopias do is to give you a space in which you can imagine a radically different alternative. And that process of imagination is actually a kind of speculative sociology. What other kinds of systems are theoretically and perhaps practically possible, and what kind of futures then are possible and desirable? And unlike philosophical approaches which work in terms of abstraction, like justice and fairness and even equality, what the sociological approach requires that you do is to talk about the actual institutions within which these processes are embedded. So it's a modeling of alternatives, and that these are fictions which enable us not only to think about how alternative futures might be, but to explore imaginatively how it might feel to inhabit them. And Edward Thompson, commenting on William Morris, referred to this process as the education of desire. So I'd want to say, though, that utopia is not a plan. Utopia in this sense is not a plan. It is a method of exploration, of imagining possible futures, of uncovering the implicit views of the good society in our present politics and policy proposals. And both of those entail a consideration of what constitutes human flourishing. You cannot think about the good society without thinking about what does it mean to be human, even though we know that what it means to be human is in part historically and socially determined. So this is not a plan, it's a method which has to be engaged in collaboratively, dialogically. It needs to be reflexive in that we need to understand the limitation of our own understanding and the way it's influenced by the place that we occupy in the social system. So the argument is that utopia is a method, not a plan, and that all actual utopian visions will turn out to be failures, because actually, when you start putting things into practice, you will find that there are unintended consequences, both positive and negative, as was mentioned in the last panel, so that you have to be constantly and collaboratively revising what this will look like. A lot of the point of this for me is actually social transformation. It's not just about spaces to creatively imagine something else. It's about ways in which we might collectively act to change the situation that we find ourselves in, which is for a great many people absolutely intolerable, and for all of us is seriously dangerous. But I want to make another point, which is about top-down and bottom-up intervention. It seems to me that if you think systemically about social processes, this is a false antithesis. Changes at the top have a very profound effect on what kinds of bottom-up change are possible. Example, in 1852 or 54, not sure, Christian Socialist group in London was instrumental in passing the Industrial and Provident Societies Act, which gave limited liability to joint stock companies. Very technical. It was absolutely fundamental to the development of cooperative enterprises thereafter, because it enabled individual members of these not to be liable for the losses of the whole. So what happens at the level of the state is actually fundamental to what kind of bottom-up changes become possible. And at the moment, the free market is held in place by a lot of state-supported legal apparatuses that ensure property rights and contract, so that these things are indivisible. Do you want me to stop, or can I make one more point?
You can make one more point.
I want to make one more point, which is in relation to the question of space and place. In a way, the imaginative space is a metaphor. The space of intervention, space is a metaphor. Space is also real and involves real places. But I'm very worried about the notion that belonging should be attached to settledness in place. And I'm concerned about this because we live in a context of mass migration and displacement, and ecological challenges are going to bring more forced migration. But I'm concerned about it also because my grandparents were among the 3 million Jews who fled the Pale of Settlement and anti-Semitic persecution between 1880 and 1914. And those parts of the family that I've been able to trace diasporically are now settled in America, Ireland, Britain, France, and Israel. And in every case, they love the countries in which they live. Indeed, those migrants loved New York and loved America before they even arrived there. And so the love of place does not mean that you have to be settled there for generations. My Lithuanian grandfather loved Ireland. Many migrants will love deeply the place where they have been able to make a life in cooperation and collaboration with others.
Okay, I want to come to this idea of place because I think, for me at least, reading the essays, it was common to all three of you that you agreed on the importance of place in and of itself as a key component of prosperity. But maybe we could just take that point very quickly, Roger. Would you fundamentally disagree with what Ruth has said there about diaspora? Does diaspora provide us with a challenge to the idea of settling down? And how do we approach this idea of love of home in a world increasingly globalized, in which travel is lauded by everyone and wished for by many? Is there a potential conflict in this love of home and the idea of Ruth's experience, actually her family experience of coming from one place to another?
Well, of course there is tension. I would say that most migrants are looking for somewhere to settle. And if you take away the idea of settlement as the end point of this, you take away the motive of migration. Of course, you might be fleeing from something terrible. That's a different thing. But you'll only achieve safety in your flight if there is some place which provides it, and that's the place where you will settle. We are lucky in this island, of course, that it's been a refuge for so many hundreds of years that we've been able to absorb, to a certain extent at least, quite a lot of migration. And we've also got an ongoing sense of this as our home, which has been renewed down the centuries and is not disrupted in the same way as, for example, large parts of the Middle East are disrupted by the migration of communities across borders. So, but of course there's going to be a tension. I don't think one can necessarily produce a solution to this just by reflecting on the environmental problem. That, this is something which the whole world now is confronting and not knowing quite what to do about. But if you lose sight of that thing which I'm talking about, namely belonging, then you have got no hope of a solution at all.
Okay, I suspect we may come back to the question of migration, not least because it is politically coloured, and there are clearly political differences between our speakers, and I want to come back to that as well. But let me first turn to you, John, because in a sense you provide us with a much more fundamental challenge, in a sense, thinking along the lines of my metaphor of space. And I do agree with Ruth, it is very much a metaphor of space. The space within which we have to negotiate sustainable prosperity, indeed any kind of alternative, is constrained by language itself, and in your view, primarily at this point, the language of capital. So tell us a little bit about what has gone wrong with that language and where life after capital might begin to make sense of prosperity.
Okay, so I'll actually, that's a really nice way in, because Rowan's here, so as a good Catholic atheist, right, I'm going to start with a bit of Bible reading, right, yeah. So this is from, and as a Catholic atheist, it's the wrong Bible, it's the King James's Bible. So it's where, in Ecclesiastes, they say, cast thy bread upon waters and they shall find it after many years. That's translated in the Good News Bible for Americans in ordinary English as invest your money in foreign trade and one of these days you'll make a profit. Right. And what that captures is a certain kind of picture of prosperity, right? That prosperity is about getting, and it's what's often known as prosperity theology. It's you believe in God because it's going to get you stuff, right? What worries me a little bit is there's a similar thing going on which is almost like a prosperity ecology. And it's in the language of capital. So I used to have friends, and I used to have family, and I used to have colleagues. Now I've got social capital, right? And Roger, I think, uses the term, and I have real worries with it. And I was trying to explain why. And actually what my worry is precisely what happens in that quote that I mentioned. That you've moved along feelings of generosity towards particular others that matter to you, or to strangers that matter to you as well in that context, to thinking about what does it do for me in terms of something else, in terms of what I get out of it, right? And I'll come back to that in a moment. The other metaphor that dominates everything is natural capital. Right. So I used to go for walks in the countryside. I used to do gardening. I used to work on allotments and so on. Now I'm surrounded by natural capital. Right. And what's going on? And when I go to policy areas now in Manchester, we're talking about green space in Manchester, and everything's done in terms of natural capital. Right. That's the language you have to speak, and you get a closure off of how you can think of the world once you start doing that. And it's likewise, you know, if you look at the Government Committee on Biodiversity now, it's the Natural Capital Committee. Right. So what's going on when we start thinking of the natural world as capital? And I think there's at least 5 different claims that you need to separate out, and that's what I do in the paper. There's a basic claim that you see things primarily as benefit streams. That's how the economists talk about it. So it's a stream of benefits or services to you. And there are services, I'm not going to deny it, but this notion of ecosystem services becomes the dominant metaphor. Once you have that, and the way that the economists use the concept of services, a service is, what matters is the service and not the object. So the object is the mere vehicle for the service. Once you have that picture, another object that provides the same services can be substituted for it, and you can compensate. What lies behind a great deal of biodiversity policy now at the European level and at the UK level is this idea of no net loss. So actually we can destroy one area of biodiversity because as long as we create another area of biodiversity, we haven't lost anything. Right? So nature becomes very, it becomes substitutable across areas. So you've got that. A third thing that's around natural capital is was mentioned in one of the questions, is monetization. So the idea that you can put monetary values on natural capital, and then you can actually compute how much you pay in compensation for its loss. The fourth one is marketization. So what you've had is increasing development, for example, of carbon markets as the way of resolving climate change issues. But in the biodiversity area, you've got now biodiversity markets or offset markets. So a landowner can develop a bit of area where he says that he's going to leave that untouched. A developer destroys someplace elsewhere, and they can have a market transaction, so there's no net loss. So you have offset market. And finally, you have what you might call financialization. And that is, you don't just treat nature as a benefit stream, you treat it as a financial stream. And you have that basic notion of financialization, and offset markets provide one way of doing that. If you take climate change, most of the climate transactions in certain years are done in futures markets. Right, so you start treating those as financial transactions, and you try and govern risk through financial instruments like derivatives, futures markets, and so on. So you've got this growing financialization of nature as well. Now, those are independent claims. I mean, you can take the basic claim, but still, reject financialization and marketization and so on. I'm not rushing or pushing all of those together, but there are 5 claims. But the fundamental one at the start of it is this notion that you treat things merely as vehicles for providing services. And what I think that gets wrong is it misunderstands why people are concerned about the natural world. So I make a distinction, I pick up on a logical distinction that's made in philosophy between de re and de dicto valuations. So that sounds, that's a bit fancy Latin in there, but the way to get that distinction is through a really bad joke. So I apologize for the joke in advance, right? Which is a joke that's made about Zsa Zsa Gabor. An interviewer asked Zsa Zsa Gabor apparently, Zsa Zsa Gabor says to the interviewer, I found a new way of doing good for people, right? Yeah, I found a way of keeping my husband young and healthy. And the interviewer says, that's amazing. That's, how do you do that? And she says, I get a new one every 5 years. Right. Now, the point about that is what you expect Zsa Zsa Gabor to be saying when she says, I keep my husband young and healthy, is to value a particular person, her husband. What she values, that there is somebody that falls under description, that's why it's de dicto, that satisfies the description of being a husband and he's young and healthy. A lot of what's going on now in biodiversity offsetting treats biodiversity in that way, right? So to value an area of biodiversity is to value something de dicto, as long as it falls under a description of us having a certain species assemblage or so on, then it's substitutable by another description. That substitutability, that's already limited, I should say that. A lot of the arguments about biodiversity offsetting are exactly around what the description should be. But it misses a point of de re valuation, that people value particulars. And there's a certain amount of commonality here, right, of going across about the importance of relationships to particular others and particulars. There's a huge difference. I mean, the big difference that I would make with Roger is that Roger, it seems to me, sees the main worry as the state and sees the market as the solution. I have some of the same worries about top-down state planning, right, of a certain kind that was existed in the Soviet Union. We don't have disagreements about that. I think the major threat in the world is a certain kind of market capitalism, right, which is committed. If you have a debt-based economy, it's committed to growth into the future because you have to keep growing to pay back debts, right? So that debt-based economy is almost in there already. But more generally, I think that it's the actual spread of markets and the extent of commodification and marketization wherein lies the problem. And I just finished by saying, and that makes me very pleased to be in the William Morris Society place here, because one of the sources of my beliefs was always William Morris and the kind of non-market socialism that he defended. But I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Roger, it did seem to me as I was reading that there were surprising commonalities. This sense, for example, of things being seen as an end rather than a means to an end, the sense of place as being important. How much of what John said would you disagree with?
I don't disagree with it very much. I think what he's talking about is exactly what I mean by belonging. The attachment to something for its own sake, which makes it irreplaceable, unsubstitutable. And we all know that markets only take off when things can be given their equivalent in some other currency. That's what a market is. It's a system of exchange. So if we're thinking about things whose value is not an exchange value but an intrinsic value, that's what the environment is, then what John says is absolutely right, and I agree with it. I don't use the language of political economy, it's true. I use, I think, a slightly more poetic language, because in things that matter, we don't understand them scientifically. We only understand them poetically in the end. This is so obvious from sex. We all know that in the end, we can only explain only say to ourselves what it is that matters about the object of sexual desire by using poetic idioms, not by attributing a value to that person that can be supplied by someone else. This is the essence of the sexual predicament in which we all are.
Okay, let's talk about sex.
Yeah, it's actually much more amenable.
We were challenged actually earlier on the question of, is this an artistic conversation? And in a sense, what Ruth, you've called up is that creative power, that ability to be creative and imaginative and approaching that in a certain way. Now, I'm going to take aside for a moment, and I hope that you will as well, John, the slightly pejorative sense that Roger's writing in a poetic way and you're writing in a political economy way, because I'm not sure where that takes us, really. But is this an artistic conversation? Is it a political conversation? Is it a scientific conversation? Ruth, I was very struck by something in your talking about the process of utopian thinking as being fraught with failure. In other words, it's a process of conjecture on the one hand, here's a possibility, and refutation, actually no, it doesn't work, which is of course precisely Popper's view of scientific knowledge and the progress of knowledge. What would be your sense of that as a process, and where would you disagree with the way that Roger conceives of it?
I think that where I would disagree is that I think it sets up too much of a binary between thought and feeling. Andrew Sayre's book on why things matter to people is very, very good on this. But in terms of my own work, the book on utopia as method starts with looking at the way in which utopian desire is refracted through art and music, and in particular freighted onto the colour blue. So I'm writing there about art, about the way people, about music and the way people talk about music. And that I think that the fundamental desire for belonging and connection is something that all of us recognize, but might construe rather differently. For me, this is the notion of home is perhaps a metaphor here. When Ernst Bloch, who is the greatest philosopher of utopias, talks about Heimat, he is talking about being at home in the world. He is talking about what Marx and Morris would put as the transcendence of alienation. He is talking about what Paul Tillich is talking about when he talks about grace. And so these questions of belonging, which necessarily happen in particular places, these questions of belonging are not necessarily tied to place. It's what Buber talks about in the I-thou, the other as an end in themselves rather than a means to an end. So I think, I think there is an agreement here that human beings are more than economic relationships. But I think there are different ways of construing it.
I mean, in a sense, you wouldn't necessarily expect a defender of the markets to be defending a poetic view of human nature. Instead
I'm only a qualified defender of the market.
Okay. And what would your qualifications be?
Precisely the ones that John was explaining. I think there are those things where reasoning about means comes to an end because you've come to the end.
Could you move the microphone just a little closer?
Yes,
Brilliant, thanks.
you've come to the end on which your values rest, and I think we all agree about that. It's just there is some disagreement about what those values are. But
are there disagreements about what those values are?
No, perhaps not, but you were trying to inflict upon us a contest over method, which we perhaps don't need to get into.
Okay, I will try not to inflict conflicts on you.
No. But, what I would like to say, though, is an important thing. I became very aware of the integrated nature of the environmental questions that confront us in that time in my life when I was involved in Eastern Europe, and in particular involved in people who thought using those categories from Husserl, adapted by Patočka, in order to describe their situation. In particular, the German word Umwelt already implies something more than just environment. There's a world in which we situate ourselves. And of course, Husserl said that the Umwelt is a Naturwelt and a Lebenswelt. It's a world which is described and made real to ourselves through our own ways of conceptualizing it, which are not necessarily the scientific ways, but the ways which endow it with meaning. And that's really what was threatened for them by environmental degradation. A source of meaning in their life was being spoiled and desecrated. And I feel that this is right, and it's necessary, therefore, to find the language with which to describe that meaning.
And another point at which you wouldn't disagree with John. Now, one of the reasons why I posed this, and I apologize if it was trying to impose conflicts on you, this distinction between a language of poetry and a language of science or philosophy, actually was because a part of the Cusp Vision and a part of what Will was doing with the essay series was to bring into the public attention the importance of the language with which we speak about these issues,
Yes.
and in fact to bring rigor into that conversation alongside poetry, no doubt. And that's something, John, that I know that you are very particular about, and it comes, of course, from a background in philosophy and an importance of political ecology. You've framed your critique really around precision of language. Would you defend that against poetry?
No, I'm not. I've got nothing against poetry at all. I write some sometimes. But I mean, can I just pick up? I mean, I think analytical rigor is important, right? And my background's in analytical philosophy, and I've got no apology for holding on to analytical rigor. There's a couple of things that I would want to pick up, right? One is around home, yeah, and the metaphor of home, because I just want to come into that conversation, and I want to follow it up with something else. I mean, I think. I mean, like Ruth, you know, my family's from a diaspora. It's from the Irish diaspora, right? From the Irish famine, where people's homes were destroyed around them, right? Yeah. So home is important, right? And what worries me a little bit about the way that you develop it, Roger, is two things. One is, it's a point that Berger makes in an essay, a really nice essay. I won't read out the quote. But is the tendency to identify home with property and home with nation. And it's those two identifications that I find problematic. With property, it seems to me, you know, I was brought up in a council house, right, lived there for 50 years, and it was a home, right? We didn't have property rights in it or anything of that kind. On the other hand, I remember when Margaret Thatcher introduced buying council houses, one of the things that horrified people, and there was a real moral economy conflicts that went on the estate at the time, was that people started treating their houses as assets. They weren't homes anymore. Because the whole thing about once you put something in a market, it isn't just its use value, it's got an exchange value. And you start treating those things as assets, and you start talking about climbing the property ladder. So there's a kind of identification of home with home ownership, and I think that's a really problematic identification. There's a second problematic, is the identification of home with homeland or nation. And I always like, there's a wonderful essay by Emma Goldman, the anarchist, on patriotism, where she starts off with saying, is patriotism the love of the place that you're from? And she says, well, no, it's something much more abstract and general. It's an illusory community around the state, actually. And the oikophobia that Roger talks about in his book is very much about people's worries about nationality, right? And that seems to me just to get the wrong place. And it relates to the immigration question, because I think if you take home seriously, then you have to start thinking about an ethic of what that means. And for me, that's an ethic of hospitality. I mean, and it's an ethic about what you do when people are homeless, right? So my dad worked for Shelter after a life as a builder's labourer. And it's what you owe to people that are homeless. And I take Ruth's point that actually in a situation of climate change, there's going to be climate refugees who are homeless. And it's then partly where that's being caused by certain actions, what you owe those people who are homeless. And there's an ethic of hospitality about that. Rather than, I'll just say, is a metaphor that I've never liked is the Englishman's home is his castle. That kind of has that idea of you drawing up taking up the drawbridge. And I think that notion, and when it comes to immigration, again, it's where I do share some things with Roger, is the importance of the kind of middle level associations. And what strikes me about the immigrants that I know, it's the importance of that middle level that comes in. So in Moss Side, where I go through there, the allotment is a really, Moss Side is full of immigrants, but they all communicate around the allotment and the boxing club. Next door in the council estate, Polish refugees, Polish immigrants, not refugees, Polish immigrants came in. They were Catholic, my mum's Catholic, as I say, I'm a good Catholic atheist. But they went to the same school, they go to the same church, so they're integrated into the same community. So the level of nationality, I think, is actually quite a dangerous one to be thinking in terms of with home, because it often gets in the way of where we think about homemaking and developing relationships of hospitality.
Ruth, you talk quite a lot about homemaking and an ethic of care. Would you agree with John's position on that?
I haven't thought of the ethic of care as being specifically about homemaking. It was the idea of an ethic of care is something which sociologists have posited as both different from a work ethic and a more appropriate ethic for a society which has large numbers of elderly people, people who are ill, lots of children, and actually all of us requiring care. It's actually drawing attention to the social need for care, and I don't mean the need for social care, I mean the social need for care and for reproductive labour, all those forms of labour which mostly take place outside the market, which sustain us all physically in terms of feeding us, nurturing us, looking after us when we're ill. So an ethic of care, I mean, some of it has to do with homemaking, and I think that homemaking is actually quite important. But the ethic of care is not about unpaid labour in the home. The ethic of care is about how we as a society organise those issues. And one of the, I mean, John Bellamy Foster's paper, which unfortunately we're not discussing today, I think is in many ways very, very good on Morris and Ruskin and good work. But what it doesn't do is address all those forms of work which are largely non-market work, and the question of how we organise the total organisation of labour. But I wanted to say something else about home, which is, again, picks up really on what John is saying. Roger, you mentioned Edgar Wright's Heimat. Absolutely wonderful kind of sort of 60 hours of television. But what Rice says about the second series of Heimat, quite explicitly, is that the first series is about the home from which people came. He talks about, for the second series, Die zweite Heimat. And Die zweite Heimat, the second homeland, is not a place, although it happens in a place that happens to be Munich. Die zweite Heimat is the home that the social and cultural home that we make for ourselves, which in the case of the television series, Die zweite Heimat is the social relations between a group of music students and their home in music. So Die zweite Heimat is something we can make for ourselves. And as I say, it happens to take place in Munich, but it doesn't have to.
Anywhere.
Could be anywhere. Could
Um,
be anywhere with a conservatoire.
Very quickly, because I want to open this out to the audience. Roger, the dangers of home in nationalism?
I repudiate everything that John said about this. I think it's a complete load of leftist prejudice. You can only offer hospitality if you have a home from which you're offering it. This doesn't mean if you have that home that you're against other people having their homes or other people coming into it. But, there has to be a place where you situate your own generosity and from which you are, as it were, doling it out. And there's so much in the rhetoric of all this which makes it look as though I, as an ordinary Englishman who loves England, are somehow doing something wrong in doing so. On the contrary, my love of England is the extension of my love of my wife and my horses and the little patch of land where I'm situated. And I recognize this also as the foundation for a more inclusive first-person plural in which my country as a whole is involved, which will ask me for sacrifices sometimes, not just paying taxes, but looking after my neighbours, fighting in a war, all the other things that will make it possible for that organisation to endure. And I think it's ridiculous to dismiss this as somehow a threat to the ordinary natural way of being. On the contrary, it's presupposed in every kind of generosity. So I repudiate all that anti-nationalist stuff. and I think
So
you
it
do
isn't,
too in your
it isn't
in your
nationalist.
heart.
Okay.
When if it came to the situation of the Irish immigrant in Britain, you would be exactly of my sentiment.
John.
I mean, we can carry on this disagreement in a moment. Can I just build up another disagreement as well?
Okay.
Can I just
Let's
add one?
stack them up.
Right, yeah, we stack them up. Right, because, I mean, we do have a disagreement around that. But the other one is the one that you introduced with science. And you talk about science and poetry. I don't think that's the really important distinction when we're thinking about markets, and Roger's case for markets and my worries about markets. It's actually a distinction that Hayek drew. I mean, Roger's defense of markets is really a Hayekian defense.
Yeah.
And it's really built on an epistemic case about the importance of local knowledge, which is practical knowledge, which can't always be articulated and can't be passed on to a central planning board. And I think there's something right about that. So, and it's, my book, Critical of Markets, was a conversation with Hayek, because I think
I've read that book and I agree with most of it.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Where I think but there's another side of it, which is the role of scientific knowledge, and there is a role for scientific knowledge. And if we talk about climate change, we only know about climate change because of science. We only know about the dangers of climate change because of science. And there is a role for scientific expertise. And it really then becomes an issue about the relationship between scientific expertise and democracy. But that scientific knowledge is specialized knowledge which is different in kind from that decentralized. Well, it's not different in kind, actually, because that knowledge is again, part of its being expert knowledge is that it can't be fully articulated and defended and passed down. So a lot of the science that happens about that, I don't understand, but I have to build it on trust and testimony and so forth. Sorry, you want to stop me.
I want to allow other people in. I mean, I think it's
right.
an important point.
Right. I think there's arguments here about the role of knowledge in economies, and I think that's a really important argument we haven't had.
This is exactly what Will wanted to happen. So this is philosophy in action, ladies and gentlemen, and it's now your turn to participate. So people who haven't, if possible, spoken before, so the lady on the table with glasses there, I'm going to start with you, right in the middle. We'll do as Will did, with three questions in a row. The gentleman right at the back, Steve, I think it is, if my eyesight hasn't failed me. And yes, this gentleman over here with the maroon sweater.
Can you ask him to stand up?
Yeah, could you stand up and speak so that we see who you are, and introduce yourself?
Hello, my name's Cheryl, and I thought that Ruth Levitas' articulation of the sort of social problem of belonging being attached to home was just perfect, and I'd like to put to the panel a sort of environmental problem of that association as well, and to get your views on that, which is that so much of what we do at home is connected with the world outside our home. So what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, everything we buy, it's produced elsewhere by others. And we've talked about the sort of, I guess, talking about sociology and the interrelationships between people. But my interest was, if we're talking about this as an environmental sort of movement, to me, the home can't be isolated from, ecosystems and other places in that way as a starting point of an environmental movement. So obviously that's what I'd like comments on.
Okay, a fundamental question of distancing that maybe the notion of home doesn't quite account for. Steve in the back.
Thank you. Steve Smith from the Centre for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Surrey. This question's primarily directed to Roger, but a welcome comments from everyone. I was interested to hear what Roger said about being very willing to surrender to a national authority for national goods, like paying your taxes, but perhaps less willing to surrender to global goods under a global authority somehow. So my question is, there are some concerns, like global carbon dioxide concentrations, for example, that can only be measured at the global scale, how can any individual, even the most motivated one, know what their sustainable allocation of carbon would be unless you have those global institutions to measure and to manage that? Surely it's more important that we succeed in stabilizing our climate, even if we have to enforce it, than to maintain some ideological aversion to any form of global governance.
Very interesting. Another reflection on distance and space. And the gentleman here?
Hi there. This one's for John, and reflecting on natural capital and his really excellent essay. So, my name's Chris Hopkins. I work for the Green Economy Coalition on policy. And so, if there is an organisation, or if there is such a thing as, I know, prosperity ecology, we're probably for it. And I don't really know how to feel about that. But anyway. So my question is, based on what you've said, we work a lot on natural capital in our organisation, but I don't think we disagree in any fundamental way with anything you've said today or anything that's in this essay. And there was a very long version of this question with lots of caveats, and I'm going to go straight to the shortened one, which is your main concern with natural capital that it and de dicto valuation becomes the dominant framing? Is that your main concern? And so are you fine for there being a role for natural capital in kind of international high policy as long as it can live comfortably and without crowding out this de-revaluation that we all care about?
Let's come to that question first, because it's a very specific question for you, John. Is natural capital ever a useful concept?
Right, I tend to, you know, what am I going to say here? My big concern is that in a world of markets and capital, it's inevitably the dominant language. And it raises really big issues of environmental justice, which is actually related, in a sense, to the language of poetry. That there's a certain language of valuation which starts to dominate policy. And my experience is that once that language dominates, given the dominance of the institutions, it's not just the language, you're in an institutional context of markets and real capital, I mean, you know, capital as in capital of capitalism. In that context, right, that language will dominate. And it does crowd out other ways of talking and other ways of speaking and other institutional forms in which we care about the natural environment. And that becomes a justice issue because this is a good point that Joanne Martinez-Allier makes, that other languages of valuation don't get heard. So there's a kind of procedural injustice and a recognitional injustice that arises out from that. So that would be my response to you, right, yeah.
So would you absolutely argue that all of those who are trying to conserve forests, habitats, biodiversity at the moment, and who see in the Natural Capital Committee and the language of natural capital an ability to do that are mistaken? Well,
what I think it does is it reproduces a policy world. Right, and this is the bit, and it's a real problem that people have, because you've got a policy world that's dominated by that language. So it's very easy to then get into an instrumental trap, is saying, if I'm going to get on in this world, what do I do? So I have to use that language, and I think that's where most activists or people that are concerned with it come from. And what I think it does is it reproduces that world. Right, and I think, I mean, this is going back to the Eastern Europe, there's a great essay by Havel on living in truth. And there's a wonderful example in Havel where he's talking about a grocer that puts up Workers of the World Unite. And he says the grocer doesn't believe it. The secret police who are looking at the grocer doesn't believe it. The grocer knows that the secret police don't believe it. He knows that they don't believe it, but everybody has to live a lie. And what worries me a little bit is you get that kind of world in policy worlds where everybody, I've been in there, where I've said, you know, when we were doing work on climate justice, where policymakers, you know, they say, well, forget all this language. I mean, someone actually said to me from the Environment Agency, forget talking about justice, how much is it going to save? Right, I think once you go into that, then you impoverish languages. Right.
Very interesting. Living in Truth. Havel, of course, spent years in jail from Living in Truth, but presumably if we listen to Melissa from the earlier session, he at least had some ability there to be both free and happy. So. Yeah, and he got to write some plays. How much more could you ask in a period of time?
Yeah.
Ruth, let's turn to these questions of distancing and the problem that actually both supply chains and environmental issues are distanced from whatever home might be conceived of.
Well, I thought that first question of recognising that what we do in the home can't be isolated from ecosystems and is connected to what goes on outside. I think that's a really important point, but I also think we live in a society, certainly in the UK, with an increasing privatisation of everything, so that there's more and more kind of emphasis on basically what you can have and do within your home if you're lucky enough to have one. Interestingly, to go back to an earlier discussion, the way in which people generally now don't talk about buying a house or buying a home, they talk about buying a property.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of language is really quite pernicious. But of course, although it's true that what goes on inside the home is connected with everything else, the problem with some of the ways in which we tend to address that is to think that therefore individuals can change that by what they do inside their home, the recycling, the stuff in the eye this morning about not using chemicals, all of which may be important and very good, but actually the way in which those things need to be addressed is on a systemic and structural scale, so that the actual supply chains get addressed.
Okay, so these are really challenges to you, I think, Roger, in a sense, that this notion of home is sometimes too inward-looking to deal with both the distancing of impact, externalities, and the connectivity of complex global world.
Well, yes, Cheryl's worry is a very important one, and I would be the last person to suggest that the idea of home was all that you needed and sufficient to solve all environmental problems. But you've got to start somewhere. It's like charity. It's got to start at home, otherwise it never exists. And she's absolutely right that that everything that you touch in the home is connected by unseen threads to everywhere else in the globe these days, and globalization has left its mark on everything. It doesn't follow from that, though, that one must simply relinquish all attempts to make one's own little place, relinquish the place that one is, and all one's attempts to make it into a model of being somewhere and belonging. And that's what we all do, you know. When I put down the supper for my children, it is mostly come from India and in places like that. I've opened one of those wretched tikka chicken things and poured it on top of them, the meat and so on. But that's great because they love it, and it makes them feel that this is home, which is what the whole purpose of it was. But it means that we're never going to be able to disconnect our homes from the global economy. On the other hand, there's a very powerful environmental argument for relocalizing as much of the economy as we can, and I accept that. And where we are, we try to do it. We're struggling to keep our farmers' market going and to resist the regulations that try to stop us. And that's one of the things that we should do. So I think there's a very good point there, but it doesn't say that the idea of home is impossible, it means that we've got to take it seriously and fight back. As for the business of the global problems that can only be solved by global means, that's obviously true. It's been true from the beginning of history that things like wars and migrations and all that, these can only be settled in the end by some kind of transnational activity. We would hope, being in the aftermath of the 20th century, that transnational activity will be non-violent, proceeding by agreements and treaties and all the rest. It so happens, though, that the treaties have not so far been very successful. So we need to reflect, first of all, on whether we know enough to make those treaties successful, and secondly, whether we have the clout with which to compel the non-compliers to agree with them. And of course, both of those we have failed in.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. And if you could make them quite short, quick fire. Yes, the gentleman at the back with his hand up, the lady with the black sweater in the middle here, and let me take one more if there is one. Yes, the gentleman with the beard.
Sorry to come back to Roger's thing again. He mentions it's not the human propensity to consume resources that threatens the small-scale sustainable community, but the human propensity to seize those resources by violence. Now, presumably this goes back to the first person who seized from the commons and said, this is my property, it belongs to me and no one else. Now, it's one sentence demolition of the whole concept of private property, but presumably this is because of trust and lack of trust that the other people would give them what they needed when they required it. And for any visions of utopia in the future, or anything, we're not going to just go to hell in a handcart, we're going to get anywhere better. We need to trust in each other more. Have the panelists got any ideas as to how we can increase the trust we have in each other?
Very important point about trust. The lady in the middle table here, put your hand up again. Yeah. And
Hi.
stand up.
Oh, hello. Laurel Gallagher from Feral Spaces. I wanted to ask John again about the natural capital. I'm really interested in that. Project I run is trying to resist actually the need to sort of capitalise and consumerise everything, experiences in nature for children in particular. My project tries to connect young people with nature in a very meaningful way where we put experience and process over consumption. But I constantly find that people want me to present my stuff, you know, turn it into an app, turn it into a colouring book, turn it into something we can consume and we can purchase. So methods of resistance, please.
And the gentleman here.
This is a question mainly for Roger, because you were talking at the end there about transnational solutions to problems like war or conflict, but in your early remarks when you were talking about home and sense of place and your horses and the sense of national belonging, you moved very quickly from talking about that sense of belonging to a nation that might call upon you to go to war, in a sense that might almost be some sense of a duty almost. But if one sets up the sense of belonging in those national terms, then of course you might eventually get to a point where you construe war or conflict as some kind of necessity that's born out of that sense of belonging, rather than a kind of avoidable problem that might be dealt with by recognizing the kinds of political, material and economic forces that lead to those conflicts. So is there no problem when you think of belonging in that national sense that you're immediately in your own rhetoric obliged to at some point talk about a nation that might call upon you to go to war? I see that as a bad thing.
Let's go to that question first, Roger.
Well, we all know that there is a difference between aggression and defence, and our country was the victim of massive aggression, and the last time it was in a major war, and there was a duty to defend it. I don't have any doubt about that. You know, of course, if we have to think in a utopian way, in the sort of a utopia that Ruth would like us to think about, we should be imagining those circumstances where there will be no more wars, because there will not be the kind of conflicts of interest that create them. But my response to that is to say, yes, but get real. the world isn't like that. And if we're to survive in the world as it is, we do need collective loyalties. We do need to stand side by side defending ourselves. Doesn't mean that we have a right to be aggressive. And so, this is the way things are. My hope is that within that kind of loyalty, that kind of first-person plural of the nation-state, we will be able to find the motives that will enable us also to look after the little place that is ours and set an example, and then cooperate with others to spread that example around the world in such a way that it is no longer a mess. But you've got to start somewhere, and you start, in my view, when you put that plate of food down in front of your child.
Ruth?
I want to come back on that because I have not said here or anywhere else that the imagined alternative futures that we need to use as a method for addressing the future would be characterized by there being no conflict of interest. That's a completely spurious comment. Marge Piercy, in Women on the Edge of Time, has quite a long section on the resolution of conflicts of interest, which are often conflicts of interest over access to raw materials and water and so on. And the summation of how do we deal with this is we argue how else. But I'd want to also come back and to respond to Owen's point and also to Roger's point about we all know the difference between aggression and defense. I think part of the problem is that we don't. And if we hook that back to the problem of migration, is that we wouldn't really have quite such a problem, if you construe it a problem, of mass migration from Syria if we weren't bombing the hell out of it. So if we actually want to reduce levels of migration, should we wish to do so, one of the things we have to do is to stop dropping bombs on other people's homes and also reduce the levels of material inequality that contribute to the kind of push-pull situation. And I completely agree to think about what the causes are of war, which are frequently competition for scarce resources, which need to be resolved in a different way. We could also, of course, stop selling arms to other governments who are wreaking havoc on their own and neighbouring populations.
So is one of the methods of resistance, to come to the third question, is that some understanding of this relationship between defense and aggression, would you say, Ruth?
I think I think that we need to understand that there will always be different points of view, and one person's aggression will be seen as another person's defense, and we have to find different ways of addressing these conflicting views of the world and conflicting interests, other than killing each other. And I think that's really, but Owen was saying, isn't the cultivation of belonging in national terms really something that contributes to war, rather than helping us to find another way forward?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, partly because we have Uffe here, and part of what Uffe was doing with Alternative in Denmark was to try and establish a different way of doing politics, as well as a different domain of that politics. And part of that was quite precisely understanding better how to be less conflictual in the resolution of those issues. But to come back to this question of resistance, and I think I'll let John, and if you'd like to come back as well, Roger, on this question of, what are the sphere of resistance? John, you've put a very strong case that actually a part of that has to be within the language that we use itself.
Yeah, but I want to make clear that it's not just that. I mean, so you get, resistance happens all the time. So if when people are asked to put monetary valuations on goods to accept compensation, people will often say things like, there's nothing that could compensate for the loss of this good, right? In monetary terms, it's the inappropriate language to do it. So in the essay, I quote someone who was going to lose their homes because of the Narmada Dam, and they're offered compensation, and they say there's no monetary value that could compensate for that. But there's also real resistance about not just the language, but the fact that capital itself is always on a commodity frontier, and it's always looking for new places to extract resources. And what you get there is resistance, and you get that resistance on, a lot of the work I'm increasingly think is really important is supporting those kinds of resistance. And that can happen in both ways. So if I take the offset case, there's a really great film. If people want to email me, I can send them the links, which some activists that I know put together about Rio Tinto Zinc in Madagascar, which was a classic offsetting. So it comes along and says, we're going to destroy all this biodiversity, but we're offsetting because BirdLife International and a local NGO are going to protect this other area. Protecting that other area meant going in and robbing people of their livelihood because they were no longer allowed to use the forest anymore, and not even telling them at the time about the offsetting project, that it was as part of an offsetting project. And what the activists went in and actually told them that, and of course at that point, they resist. But one of the worries, and this is the worry that I have with the natural capital, but in a real sense now, is once you make, through offsetting and that kind of natural capital language, the defense of, the protection of the natural world depend on its destruction somewhere else. So something becomes valuable as an offset only because you're destroying something somewhere else. What you do is you create dependencies, and you create the kind of dependencies that exist now between, I'll take it, Rio Tinto Zinc and Kew Garden, who are involved in there, with BirdLife International, with international nature conservation bodies, where actually they're now seeing that their financial income is dependent on, through offsets, so you create this very perverse asset class. And it's why, again, I think you should resist that kind of attempt to think primarily in terms of the financialization or natural capital financialization and marketization. I think it's a big error, and it's left the voice of the environment actually compromised in a lot of places now.
Roger.
I agree with John about language, and since reading his piece, I'm not going to use the phrase social capital ever again. Because I recognize that it is putting something of intrinsic value in an instrumental context.
What about natural capital?
I never have used that, but I certainly won't now, that's true. But of course I also want to say that there's something else to be added to that, the kind of language that I was trying to use in my piece, which escapes from the scientific categories altogether, is equally important because it's relating the things around us to our own feelings of love and cherishing. And science doesn't, on the whole, link the world to our loves in quite the way that we need. So I think that's one very important locus of resistance is language. But I also think, as I've said at the beginning, that the free association of rational beings is equally, if not more important. And in this country we have a wonderful record of resistance. Think of the National Trust. That was set up in the late 1890s by disciples of Ruskin, for the protection of the beauty of this country. It came out of a pure sense of love and belonging to this place. And it now has over 4 million members. It's not a state institution. It's formed under the English law of trusts, which of course is something which distinguishes us from the rest of Europe. But and it has had a huge impact in containing sprawl and containing development in ways that the people as a whole would like. And I think those, that's an example. It's not everything, but things like that are genuine centres of resistance, and they are peaceful. They're not about upsetting the whole social and political order. They're just about doing what people actually would really like to see done.
And they instill trust, the national trust.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm sorry, I should have said that. That's such an important question.
Ruth.
The trust is the answer in the end.
Yeah. Ruth, you wanted to come back particularly.
Well, somebody asked a question about how we increase trust, and none of us have seriously addressed it. And I think I mean, probably because we don't know the answer, but I think that one thing I would say is that for people to trust one another, they have to themselves have a basic certainty that their fundamental needs will be met. And what has been happening in this country for a very long time, but particularly in the last 8 years, is an unpicking and undermining of those institutions which give people a certainty that they will be housed, fed, cared for when they're sick, and that actually the Irish president, Michael D. Higgins, wrote that the fundamental character of a republic built on solidarity must begin from everybody having a kind of basic standard of living. And one of the things that I think erodes trust in social institutions, in one another, that erodes the possibility of building trustful relationships with those around you, is actually the removal of those preconditions, which would, in a way, take us back to some of the issues in the previous panel. And I myself think that the galloping levels of inequality and the increases in inequality that we've seen are fundamentally undermining of the conditions in which trust could be built.
That's probably a point on which the panel would agree. And sadly, we have reached the end of the panel discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I would really just end, apart from thanking the speakers, which I'll do in a minute, by encouraging all of you to read the essays. They're incredibly rich, thoughtful, provocative in some cases, progressive in terms of seeking solutions, and kind, humble in some rather sympathetic way, both in the way that they approach language and the way they approach the issues, and in the development of a more poetic language in itself. And I think I'd just like to end by thanking Roger, Ruth, and John, and quoting one of them, but again, a point on which I'm not sure that the others would disagree. Prosperity itself, said one of them, is not to be defined in material terms. It's a condition of well-being that stills the desire for more growth, more consumption, more distraction from our moments of serene and repeatable joy. And just so that you're not left guessing, thank you very much, Roger, for that essay. Thank you, John, for The Language of Capital. Thank you, Ruth, for Utopias. And we will move on to the next session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.